To the liberal, the only way to fully ensure that these noble goals of peace and the perfect utopian society can be attained is if liberals control government power. Even when there is an effective majority, liberals that do get into government power, they don't act very liberal, because liberalism works much better in theory and not so well in practice. Liberalism has been largely unsuccessful in its attempts to construct new procedures or institutions to deal with the problems Americans face daily, because liberalism is better out of power than it is within power. Liberalism is built to change the status quo, not to run it. It is built to tear down the existing, not to build up anew. There is an old cliche that says, we need liberals to push through the necessary reforms and conservatives to make the reforms work. Sometimes things become cliche because people say them a lot, and people say them a lot because they're true.
Now, throughout the 1940s, 50s, and into the 60s, Detroit was not the blasted ruin you see today, but the thriving, pulsating center of American business enterprise. By 1960, Detroit had the highest per capita income of any city in the United States. 1960 was the last year that Detroit had a Republican mayor. So what happened? Well, the first of the current Democratic dynasty, white liberal Jerome Kavanaugh, greatly expanded the role of city government in Democratic President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and War on Poverty programs. $490 million in federal money, that is an enormous sum in the mid-60s, went to housing projects and social programs dispersed by City Hall, and not to help small businesses and entrepreneurs keep the city economically viable. 34% of Detroit's citizens were on the welfare rolls by 1987. That's 4 times what it was just 20 years earlier. By 1990, Detroit's model city area had lost 63% of its population, 45% of its housing units, and were unimaginably violent and dangerous. This is what 55 years of death by Democrats has done to Detroit.
Whether we evaluate liberalism's effectiveness in government and its fight to end poverty and end all inequality, we can see abundantly throughout liberalism's rhetoric and actions that the liberal guilt is always a part of the liberal syndrome, and it implies rules and regulations attempting to solve the problem. But when these initiatives fail, as they nearly always do, to end the problem, the guilt of the liberal swells greater once finding out the world's problems have not vanished despite its tender touch in government. So when the liberal agenda in government fails, the failure is not due to the flawed ideology, it is due to it wasn't done enough, and more government effort is needed. According to Obama, Obamacare is working, and it would be working better if conservatives weren't always in his way.
Aetna is saying that they're losing $320 million. They're losing a ton of money. This isn't working. The Aetna CEO had a very interesting comment. He said there are 2 kinds of insurance companies in Obamacare. The companies that are worse off and the companies that are worse off, believe it or not. Democrats want to expand government involvement into health care. Democrats want to expand government involvement into health care.
Liberals are ineffective in government because this passion for reform does not stop once in power. In many cases, it is magnified, but this becomes problematic because liberals seem completely oblivious to the fact that no government policy or social reform takes place in a vacuum. When item A is changed deliberately and abruptly instead of slowly over time, items B, C, and D are often changed as well, and in many instances, the entire situation has changed in the most unexpected ways. For example, Obama's taxing the rich has increased the gap between the rich and poor because the rich can make their money back. The middle class have to foot the bill, and much of the middle class falls into the lower class.
Our federal, state, and local governments spend more than $3.2 trillion per year on programs designed to prevent or relieve poverty. That's more than $10,000 per American. Yet the official poverty rate has fluctuated in the same narrow range, from 11 to 15% of the population for the past 40 years.
Black unemployment rates were lower than those of whites as long ago as 1890, close quote.
And in 1930 as well.
And in 1930. First of all, black unemployment was lower decades ago, before the Civil Rights Movement, before the New York Times began editorializing on the on black poverty. How can that have been?
It shows, among other, well, the minimum wage law is one huge factor. 1930 was also the last year when there was no federal minimum wage law. If you look at the unemployment rate of black teenagers in 1948, 1949, it is a fraction of what it has been in any recent decade. And 1949 was a recession year, so the black teenage unemployment rate in 1949 was a fraction of what it was in even the most prosperous years of the 1990s.
And this is because the federal minimum wage said you must pay every worker at least this much.
Yes.
And when there was no minimum wage, kids, everybody, but particularly you're talking now about black teens, could get paid
whatever.
$1.50 an hour
See, but the other thing,
but they could get employment. They could start learning skills. They could reach the first rung on the ladder, so to speak.
Yes.
That's what's, right.
And people move up very quickly. I mean, McDonald's has over 100% turnover a year. People say he's out flipping hamburgers. Yes, he's flipping hamburgers in January. Does not mean he's going to be flipping hamburgers in December.
Somewhere, he's learning how to get to work on time, how to get a
That's right, and
he's
not going to be. He's going to start up the ladder.
Right.
But what was different about the late 1940s was the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 specified what the minimum wage would be. The runaway inflation of the 1940s made that number meaningless.
I see.
So for all practical purposes, inflation had repealed the minimum wage law.
I see.
Thank God I was a teenager in those years. And you know, when I started out my first full-time job as a Western Union messenger, my starting pay was 50% above the federal minimum wage because inflation had made the federal minimum wage meaningless. And so under those conditions, in 1948, black 16 and 17-year-olds had an unemployment rate under 10% and slightly less than that of white teenagers the same age. Now, as you come in, the liberals say, no, we've got to catch up with inflation. Starting in 1950, they escalated the minimum wage regularly, and then you began to see these horrendous rates of unemployment among black teenagers.
Even if they are successful in achieving the sought-after results in one area, often some undesirable changes have arrived along with it, and what the reform has brought has come at a heavy cost, often a greater expense than the reform brought on the issue it was intended for. Though the liberal may achieve his intended result in one area, it's always shown that he has not won the war, and often loses far more than what was gained in their policy, and it does not enhance society in the way they were certain it would once the program or policy was implemented. Just like sexual harassment trainings, affirmative action, and anti-discrimination training, which most studies show can actually increase what the training is designed to prevent. These things don't worry liberals or deter them from initiating radical reform movements, because what's important is change. Just change is a sign of progress, even if the change is a negative one. But liberalism has not done so well when it has tried to shift from eliminating past abuses to the task of finding new ways to fight the poor conditions that still occur and have not changed because of the new regulations. So they simply apply the same remedies as before and advocate more education and liberal government reform, sprinkled with the optimistic view of mankind that once we implement this new plan, everything is going to be great. But that too doesn't eliminate the problem. These reforms have signally failed to eliminate or even reduce crime. Our prisons are more full than in previous centuries. Liberalism actually has proven to increase crime by being so light on it, slapping criminals on the wrist and letting them out of prison because, as the liberal doctrine says, it is not their fault. But it also creates more crime with its provocative egalitarianism and its movement that aids the destruction of traditional families, and with more broken homes, it creates more juvenile delinquency. As you can see, broken homes and the broken traditional family has directly influenced the rise of crime. Most rapists, most violent criminals, most juvenile criminals, and most long-term criminal inmates overwhelmingly did not grow up with a father in the home. Liberalism fails to see the challenges faced in America both domestically and abroad. The big government liberal lives a very sheltered life, guarded from the social horrors that law-abiding Americans face. The common everyday man or woman is the one who has to look over their shoulder and worry about the murders, muggings, rapes, and so on that criminals are doing around them. While they say these criminal actions are wrong, they do not side with the everyday man or woman who is harmed or worried about the harm they could face in the future. They side with the criminal because, as the liberal ideology states, their criminal behavior is only the result of bad institutions.
And it's precisely the same pattern for other major cities like Baltimore. Now, by the end of the 1990s, the murder rate in Baltimore was 6 times higher than in New York. 14% of the city's fourth graders can read proficiently. The Baltimore Teachers Union successfully opposed a desperate plea from city residents for a voucher program to allow them to find schools that would, actually educate their children. The $15,483 per student per year is paid to abysmal union teachers, then paid via union dues directly into the Democratic Party to run candidates that keep the heist in motion.
But what's the same in both places is that the intellectuals have told them that the world is unjust, that other people are keeping them down, that the fact that they don't have what other people have is somebody else's fault. And if you buy that vision, then of course there's no reason for you to do well in school. And you resent those who do well because they've bought into the enemy's way of thinking.
Here's a list of failed cities, and beside them, the number of years of uninterrupted democratic control.
For the liberal ideology, the urban city crime is merely temporary byproducts of lack of education and faulty institutions, to be cleared up by urban renewal programs, low rents, and high minimum wages. Liberalism cannot either see or deal with the mess of crime in urban cities and backward areas. Liberalism is unfitted by its rationalistic optimism, its permissiveness, its egalitarianism, and by its guilt. America's high percentage of multiple offenders gives liberalism an endorsement that the liberal scheme for re-educating criminals and giving them plenty of social service along with easy paroles has not worked.
Most intellectuals in most countries around the world see the issue as how those who are more prosperous should be brought down, rather than how, and moreover, that people who are lagging should cling to their culture. I don't know how you're going to keep on doing what you've always done and get results that are different from what you've always gotten.
But by manipulating public opinion, every now and then the conduct of a minority group gets so outrageous or nearly touches some public right or sovereignty that direct counterforce must be brought into the game. The police then get their clubs and riot gear, but against the background of the pervasive liberal rhetoric and the usual liberal practice in these matters, the appearance of drawn weapons on the scene seems sudden and arbitrary. If strikers or demonstrators get beaten up or thrown in jail, it is the cops and the authorities who seem by the inner logic of liberalism to be the villainous aggressors, and the final outcome is likely to be considerably more blood and bitterness than if a small number of heads had been knocked somewhat early on and deterred the crowd. Liberalism is bad in government because liberalism doesn't have a real plan to build, because it's designed to tear down. Liberalism has been more comfortable operating as simply in opposition to the existing order. The passion for change does not stop with this particular feature that we might agree needs replacement. Liberalism is set up to fight the status quo and not create a new one. In Bertrand Russell's early 20th century liberal book, Why Men Fight, he writes the task of education should not be to uphold, but to destroy. Liberalism has always stressed change, breaking free from traditions or old habits, customs, or institutions. That's the backbone and the heart of its movement. Because those old customs are the cause of ignorance, and once they're removed and replaced with more education, the problems will just solve themselves. Liberalism is the film critic who can cite everything wrong with the film, but he cannot create one of his own, certainly not one better than the film produced. Because liberalism is designed to tinker with the established order, to explain what needs fixing, not to build something better. Thus, liberalism has continued to be negative and quite destructive. In early Western society, there were a good number of deeply embedded customs that were bad in many ways, and getting rid of them was a good thing, and the liberal attitude of hostility towards custom and tradition and supreme confidence in the nature of mankind was useful for society then. But now that most of those evils have been eliminated, liberalism has to try and build anew, and it repeatedly fails.
So what you're left with after 10, 12, 14, 20 years in the leftist indoctrination centers that our schools have become are citizens of voting age who, on the one hand, are utterly unwilling and incapable of critically judging the merits of the positions they hold and have held unquestioned since they're 5 years old. A mindless indiscriminateness. So what you're left with is not only adults, citizens of voting age who cannot judge their own positions, but who are virulently antagonistic to any position other than their own. So this makes you not just wrong on your issues and your stances, they don't even think about your issues and your stances.